Greetings, everybody, and welcome back to another installment of the Healing Brothers podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Brandon Jones, and I'm joined by the legendary Sam Simmons. Sam, we've been on a little break. How's everything going?
I'm actually good. Uh, I didn't realize how stressed I was until I left town.
Mm.
Took me a few days to get unstressed. You know, by the time I made it back home, I did feel a difference in stress level. I guess I'm ready to get down now. It might get scary. Uh, had too much time to think about the people, you know, and our current challenges. So, um, yeah. So we'll see. So how you been?
I don't want to say I've been stressed, but life has brought a lot of twists and turns and some challenges. So right now I'm playing single dad for the month of September as my wife is in the hospital with preeclampsia as we get ready to bring our third child into this world. So it's been a huge adjustment. I've been maintaining the best of my ability. I think my girls and my wife obviously have probably had a harder adjustment to everything. Them not being able to have their mom for like the first day of school and just day to day, and then my wife being literally held prisoner at the hospital. It has been quite the adventurous 2.5 weeks so far, and we still got about another 2.5 weeks to go. So outside of that, I can't complain. As you stated, the community continues to be in flux. And here we are as folks who try to make a difference, try to figure out ways to improve things. And we have to balance our own personal stuff with the stuff that happens outside of our homes too. So it's not always easy, but it is something that we've been tasked with, or we accepted the challenge. Is probably a better way to say it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, so what do you want to talk about today?
So today's topic is looking at the concept of generational curses versus intergenerational trauma. Are they the same? Are they something different from one another? I hear people often, especially when I'm talking within our own community, and I'm talking about trauma or historical trauma. People always talk. They want to ask me about generational curses, and I found that a very fascinating way to talk about the topic of historical trauma or intergenerational trauma. And I wonder, are these generational curses just intergenerational trauma, or is it actually curses that are within our families that are within our community? So I wanted to break that down and get your perspective on those two concepts.
Okay. So how would you define generational curses?
So, based on my understanding and what I've gathered from people who use that term, is that we have these families that have these historical patterns that are harmful. And it's like the families can't, from one generation to the next, cannot break these harmful patterns, whether we're talking about violence or whether we're talking about, random deaths within a family or sexual abuse or other things that could be just detrimental to families. They're seen as these curses that each generation, experiences. And it seems like there's no way to stop or break those curses. And there's these patterns, these cycles that continue to go on from one generation to the next. So that's my general understanding of a generational curse.
Okay. So when I listen to you, it almost and I'm assuming I probably shouldn't, but I am that when people brought this to you, because I never have had nobody directly bring this to me. I've had conversations vaguely about them, but when the interesting thing is, I'm assuming when they brought it to you, they almost feel like there's no way to break it, like
Right.
they have no
Some
control
hopelessness.
whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And when you believe you have no control over something, you learn to accept it. At least I've seen that in families, and I've
Mm-hmm.
especially seen it amongst Black families. We accept certain things in our families sometimes, that I don't think we should, but we do, and that's
Mm-hmm.
part of our way of dealing with the continuous trauma that we have dealt with over the many generations, right? It is what it is. You know what I'm
Mhm.
saying? And when you do it like that, um, then it puts you in a position where you don't have to make no efforts,
Right.
right? And sometimes that's easier, right?
Hmm.
Um, and be in a community that don't, and again, when we talk about these things, we got to, I'm gonna be real clear. We're talking about Black folks, African Americans, uh, in our way of dealing with these kind of things and trauma. And you get this thing where, well, the other people have some of this same similar whatever, is that I'm not talking about them.
Right.
Okay, I want to make that clear. Secondly, we really, really, really need to embrace, I think, this idea, especially we of African Americans, and people keep bringing slavery up and that kind of stuff. Our full experience in America that's tied so closely to trauma, how unique our experience is than any other folks in terms of the world in some ways, right?
Hmm.
As a group of people.
Right.
Now we know that there's some individuals who have had these kind of experiences possibly, but as a group of people in United States, okay, our unique experience, we need to really, as difficult as this sound, to really embrace that uniqueness, because there's some pluses in that uniqueness if we embrace the whole idea of how unique that is,
Right.
right? When you have to find a way to navigate continuous trauma, right? In your experience in America, right? And your experience of, when I try to dig myself out of this trauma, there's new trauma that comes up the more I try to dig,
Right.
right? And sometimes if I stop digging, there's less external trauma.
Mm.
And what
Hmm.
I mean by that is, I'm starting to realize, when you start being accomplished,
Yeah.
people's in the environment or the external systems seem to come at you even harder when you become accomplished,
Hmm.
because it's like it violates that whole idea of what the ingrained undercurrent of Black folks being less than, that was so built in. Think about how built in that was for over 246 years, right? And it's still the undercurrent. It's like, how dare you do better than me? How dare you be accomplished, right?
Hmm.
And it just, and so one of the versions or ways of dealing with that is back to, it is what it is. How it
Yeah.
is being Black. It's hard being Black. If sometimes we get into, if you ain't suffered enough, you ain't Black enough, all that other kind of stuff. So when you talk about generational curses, and you frame it in a way like there's no way to get from under them, there's a kind of reservation to that makes it easy,
Right.
right? I do believe, when you talk about generational trauma and generational curses, there is an alignment with those, right? In a lot of these situations, right?
Hmm.
Um, when we talk about, even in terms of the sudden death, right?
Hmm.
When I work with my guys, and I haven't done it in a while, and I probably should do it, but it's been a little bit more difficult with doing the Zoom meetings, the written exercise, where I would have them do a family tree, and what I included in the family tree is how people die in the family, right?
Hmm.
And what kind of health issues go on in the family, which we do not talk about, right?
Right.
So in a lot of these situations, if you um, really start understanding the health history of a family, and particularly a black family, you'll start seeing certain, as you call, generational curses, if you want to use it that way.
Right.
Like in my mother's family, folks die of heart attack and barely make it past 60, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about cholesterol levels, we're talking about diabetes, we're talking about all those pieces, right? Not really keeping track of,
Right.
right? Where you can have another family, like my father's family, they have a tendency to live a little longer, right? And they might have been eating some of the same food, but again, we talk about the different dynamics of different people, the different um, backgrounds of folks. And so some of those a lot of those generational curses, maybe some of them you can't, but a lot of generational curses, if you did the research, you can get to the beginning
Right.
of them, right? When you got generations of, say, for example, sexual assault in a family, if you do the history, because we don't like to examine the history, the ugly parts of the history. Matter of fact, I don't know if we do enough job. More folks are doing it now with ancestry.com and that kind of stuff, trying to look at we're looking for all the positives in the history. But if you do the trauma tree, as I call it, because the trauma tree freed me, because it just made certain things make sense in the family, in terms of the family history and that kind of stuff. You'll start seeing that if we look at, like, for example, sexual assault run through a family, that family curse is really family secrets.
Oh, okay.
Okay. It's like when I used to tell us, when I do stuff around uh, 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 sexual assault in the Black community, and used to do that lecture. One of the stories I would tell is the story of Uncle George, right? And
Mm-hmm.
Uncle George is a deacon in the church, highly regarded in the community, the Black community that they grew up in. He's like 80 years old when he dies. So we talking about a Black man who had a long life,
Mm-hmm.
right? And which is to be celebrated, right? And so we had the day of the funeral, and this niece shows up. They ain't seen her in 10, 15 years, right? We call her Sally. Sally shows up, and you know how people, when you get a lot of people whispering, it almost sounds like a roar.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, what's she doing here? And who invited her? Now remember, she's a family member.
Right.
Okay. So we have Uncle George's funeral. Like I said, he was a deacon in the church, highly regarded in this particular Black town or Black area of the town. And so we got different pastors coming in, speaking. We're talking about a sure enough home going, all kind
Right.
of singing and all this other kind of thing, sending them home in the greatness of the
Mm-hmm.
greatness. Okay. So the funeral's over. The families are together, and as some families, the women end up in one room and the men end up in another room. And Sally goes in the room where the women are at, right? And she's in there for about 5-6 minutes. All of a sudden, you hear this blood-curdling scream come out of the room where the women at. And Sally walks out with a smile on her face. And what we find out is Uncle George had violated 3 generations of the women in that room.
Wow.
But nobody ever talked about it.
Right.
Now, they hinted about it, them hints, don't don't sit on Uncle George's lap, or you'll get some of the older ones, when they see a younger girl, when Uncle George is sitting talking to one of the young the girls or whatever, and they'll say, don't go in the room alone with him and that kind of stuff, but they never really come out and say this stuff,
Right.
right? And in that Uncle George, I've seen this scenario of Uncle George's, and they have been violating the boys in the family, and they really ain't talking about that, right? So how does that generational curse look like? In how the abuse of abused child looks like as an adult looks different ways, right? You got this bitter individual, or you got this person who always ends up in crazy relationships with crazy dudes, and and the cycle continues to be spread within the family. So I think when you talk about generational curses, there's a line between that and generational trauma, right? And most of the time we talk about generational trauma, we can go back sometime 2 or 3 generations, right? And when we talk about sexual assault in a family, that can go past all the way to slavery in terms of the sexual deviance that was that occurred during slavery on our people, right? And the fact that because of some of that generational deviance put us in a position that we don't not only generational deviance, but the proclamations of white folks talking about how oversexed black men and black women are, and that they deserve whatever they got in terms of that deviance. You understand?
Yeah.
And the thing about that is, it has put us in a position in many ways to not be able to talk openly and honestly about sexuality. Right. And if you do, you get shunned, right? And so that's just sexuality. We ain't even talking about the domestic violence,
addiction.
We ain't even talking about, the mental health, because being that we understand the background of mental health, because, one of the things I learned about mental health is even that runs in families, because especially certain mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar,
Genetic
and those kind of mental illnesses that affect the way our brains work and that kind of stuff are passed down if we don't talk about it. Because I remember when we would get clients in the lock unit and we would have difficulties with their medication, we would go through their family history and we would ask the family, is there anybody else in your family had any mental health problems? Right? And when we would deal with the white family, we didn't get that many black families. But I remember there's one black family. Well, not far as I know, but we had Aunt Mary, who was, a little different and that kind of stuff. And you do further investigation. And Mary, she had schizophrenia.
Yep.
Right. And now the other issue around that is we found that when we know the mental health of the family member, and if there was medications that had to be used or some other treatment that had to be used, when we did the research, the same or similar medications or treatment worked on that family member.
Interesting.
Because even with mental illness and even with medications, the more we're learning is they respond to different people differently. And even that response can run in families.
Interesting.
So, but I think the biggest piece is we see the outcome or the negative outcomes of these things happening in our families, but that's about as far as we go, because we don't dig no further.
Sure.
Or when you try to dig, sometimes the older generation will shut you down,
Mm.
in a way, will like you are um torturing them,
Right.
right? Why are you doing this to me? Because because shutting it down don't make it go away.
Hmm.
And and right now, with this younger generation who has, who are a lot more impatient and that kind of stuff, will ask more questions, will
Right.
do more investigations. Now, the unfortunate thing is what they do with that information is not always healthy, you know,
Hmm.
because you can have all the information in the world, but if you ain't gonna do nothing with it, or you're gonna use it as a weapon to get back at somebody, you're not moving forward.
Right.
And so, um, um, and again, we have such an interesting relationship with this thing, and unique relationship with this thing called trauma, that our struggle now is how do we face it straight on, and look at it from the standpoint of the family, and at the standpoint uh, uh, of the community,
Yeah.
right? I mean, straight on, because again, as we've often said, we easily will talk about what systems are doing or not
Right.
doing,
Right.
but when it comes to being straight up and real about the effects, see, the thing is, the effects of the continuous trauma has had on us in terms of how we relate to each other and how we relate to ourselves is a key piece of being able to move forward in a much healthier and safer way as a community.
Mm.
And and that's a broad or a big step to take as a community, right? Because you got to do a both and. Yes, this is happening to me, or yes, this has happened to me. But the next step is, yes, this is happening to me, and that, yes, that happened to me. And how the next question is being honest about how that has affected me, affected my family, and affected my community, right? In a real compassionate way. Because sometimes when we do get to a point where we done had too much or had enough, or we just get so angry when we do respond to what's going on and how it affected the community, we're so punitive to each other
Right.
that we shut it down even more.
Yep. Mm. Yeah, I think one of the key things that you said that stands out is what is the curse, and the curse is part of the curse. I would say is our inability to be honest and not telling the truth, the full truth about the situations or the things that are causing the pain within our own families and or our own communities. And I think that over time we've gotten comfortable with being like that. And that's been a cultural custom that's okay. And now it's starting to hurt us even further because all these quote unquote generational curses that we have, they're all blending into each other and they're seeping into the community. I mean, we got the traumas in the church, the traumas in the street. Our youth are all, I mean, not all of them, but too many. A significant minority of them are causing all type of chaos throughout the community. There's just a lot. There's a lot that's happening, and I think our failure to be honest about that and our willingness to stay so focused on how the system mistreats us keeps these generational curses operating. It allows these things to go unchecked. Is probably a better way to say it. And I think that to me is the significant difference between intergenerational trauma. The intergenerational trauma piece, that may have been something that was not even started within your own family or in your own community, but it still has an impact on your life. But either way, whether it's a generational curse or the intergenerational trauma, you still have an ability to do something about it. And I feel like we have been conditioned, especially in today's society to call out the systematic things that take place, but not the internal interpersonal things that take place within our community. And we see that on display damn near every weekend, especially here in the Twin Cities.
Well, the other thing is not that we don't call it out in the community, is how we call it out and when
Okay.
we call it out,
Okay.
right? Because think about it, different factions in our community will call each other out,
Mm.
right? And a lot of times very harshly,
Mm.
right? And that harshness shuts people down, right? We get into more name calling and all these other kind of things that don't solve nothing, right? And so when we do call it out, it's so over the top that it just gets messy, right? I mean, there's sometimes we'll do it, but the other piece when I talk about factions, if you do call it, sometime if you call it out and you're the voice who calls it out, you get attacked, even though people behind the scene know you're right. Because we're so busy trying to save face in when it comes to the mainstream community, right?
Mm-hmm.
The same mainstream community that we call out on a regular basis on about how they mistreat us still has an effect, and people will say, no, it doesn't affect on how we talk, be honest about our own community,
Mm-hmm.
right? We'll have a legislator who's dirty as dog nails, and no, they dirty, right? Now they might be doing some good stuff and trying to represent the people and that kind of stuff, and we won't call it out because of our fear of how the system is going to use it against that person or use it against the community, and that's a struggle. I understand that struggle, right? And the fact that systems, when they call our stuff out, they do it very harshly, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is some of that we're gonna have to suck up and be on front of, and not on the backside of it, right? I know that situations I've been in that I know is coming up, instead of running from it, um, I get in front of it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I try to get in front of it early, right? So when it does come up, it for me, I found it has less pain for me.
Mm-hmm.
I probably still gonna suffer some consequences, but it's less pain for me,
Yeah.
right? You know, and people say, well, white folks do it all the time. Again, as much as we talk about, we don't care what white folks say. Why are we always talking about comparing ourselves to what white folks do?
Right.
That don't make no sense to me, you know. And folks will bring me there. Well, white folks, yeah, they do, and you ain't white. Okay, did you forget about that? Right.
No.
And so the thing is that don't change nothing.
Right.
We always want to say that we are spiritually more humane than white folks, right? We call, some of us call them the devil, the white devils, and all this other kind of stuff, and that's fine, But again, what does that look like? What does the other side of that look like,
Mm-hmm.
right? What does the other side look like when we've talked about, I think, over the weeks or months, about adultification of our children,
Mm-hmm.
right? And adultification is when either circumstances might have a child have to do more things like an adult,
Right.
like, okay, a loss of a parent, or circumstances says that my parent got to work all the time, so I'm the oldest child, I have to take on adult roles, situational, right? But you also had that system that has a tendency to treat our kids like adults at an early age, right?
Right.
Where our kids, when they do something, they don't go to juvenile, they go straight to adult. or they're treated like adults. They look like as adults. At 5 years old, little boys are treated like 12-year-old. Oh, I thought he was a 12-year-old. A little 5-year-old boy got a toy gun.
Right.
That's their excuse. Or they did studies that when people look at a 10-year-old black girl versus a 10-year-old white girl, oh, the little white, oh, look at the little girl. And then the black girl, they'll look at her, you know. And it ain't got nothing to do with their dress or nothing. It's got to do with the way you characterize people. Right. How I see you is how I treat you. Right? And I've seen so many times where we would put our children in such adult situations, not because the circumstances call for it. We're just used to doing that.
Right.
Right. And expecting them to know better. How do you expect me to know better when you don't know better? How am I supposed to know better when I don't know?
Right.
Right. Well, you at a certain age, you should just know that. Why? Yeah. You know, how do you show me some grace and some compassion, right, as a young person, right? Right. And so, we can, we started out, we're talking about generational curses, generational trauma. A week ago, I did a show on the generational gap. And the generational, I call it a gulp, right? People used to get mad at me when I would say that because a gap you can step over, like a crack in the sidewalk. A gulp, you might need a bridge. Yeah. Right. And in some ways, there's generational gaps and gulps, or I think gulps, in our community in different areas, emotionally, understanding, trauma, even trauma-wise, right? In the vision of trauma, in the vision of how do we move forward. And so that generational curses and generational trauma, all of that ends up getting mixed together, and we're almost chasing our tail when we're talking about dealing with these issues. And you can't stop chasing your tail until you understand why you're chasing that tail. Mm-hmm. And so that means that I know that if you want to get closer to the light, sometimes you got to go deep in the dark to dig out some of that stuff, right? And get honest about it. And like we keep repeating the same stuff.
Right. It's like we hit the reset button almost. Like, let me hop in and ask a question to kind of connect this. Because I feel like when you say generation gulp, I feel like that's part of the curses. It's like a chicken and egg thing for me. It's part of the curses, but it also is a curse. Like, I don't know, and correct me if I'm wrong. But I would say since probably the 60s, each one of our generations from there as Black folks has been disconnected from one another. Where we talk about, it's like it's like each generation hits the reset button on what Black culture is, almost redefines it. And even though the trauma stays consistent, it's like each generation, there's no intergenerational approach to healing. So you hit the boomers, they have their situation. You get Generation Z, they have their own situation, and then they get infused with this new thing called hip hop, which becomes a cultural vehicle. Then you get my generation, the millennials, and then we're disconnected from the Generation Zs, and that's where we're at right now until we get this new generation, wherever they name that one. But it's like each one of those generations have had a significant event take place, whether that's the civil rights movement, crack cocaine, hip hop, community violence, whatever. You can pick whatever thing you want to pick, but each one of those generations just points the fingers at one another and say, well, in my generation, we were better than yours because we didn't do it this way, X, Y, and Z. And there really hasn't been an intergenerational approach to healing. So do you think that that's a decent assessment, or how do you see it?
Well, I find that assessment interesting. I would say, uh, uh, what you're saying makes sense. Um, but each generation, because that, the generational differences, that's actually normal.
Okay.
Okay. You got your adults and you got the young people, and the adults always telling the young people they don't know what they're talking about. And the young people feel like you the one don't know what you're talking about. Look, you still stuck in the same place you was, especially when we talk about the black community. And the younger folks, each generation, especially since the 60s, feel like the older generation is too passive. We got to fight the man, and we're gonna take on the man and that kind of thing, because the man is the problem. And but we still got still got this overt sexism going on, even in all those movements,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because in all those movements, you got overt sexism, you got overt disregard or abuse of our children. You got the infighting and all that is it just different levels, right?
Okay.
And all of us are what we're doing is fighting the trauma, right? Again, we really, really, really need to put our hands around this concept of our experience being so uniquely different when it comes to the trauma,
Mm.
especially here in America, and how much that affects how we think about things in our community and
Mm-hmm.
how we do things in our community. Because even though if you think about each of those generations, we still end up in the same space
Right.
when it's all over,
Sure. Sure.
right? But I do believe there's something that really happened and really was even more disruptive than in the usual generational differences was the crack era.
Mm-hmm.
I think that had when it comes to the trauma piece, it took the trauma piece to a whole nother level, right?
Right.
It took more of the internal trauma to a whole other level, right? Because when you're talking about the 60s, we're talking about the focus of the 50s, the civil rights movement. That was all about the external trauma. We wasn't having no conversation about what we were doing internally,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of stuff. And in the 70s, it was still the external trauma, but we ain't talking about what's going on with exploitation movies, the
Right.
pimping movement, and all this other kind of stuff. It was still external, right? Because we haven't dealt with the internal kind of stuff, the crack era blew it all up.
Sure.
Because I mean, there was some conversations between the two generations,
Sure.
every generation, right? And what we've also found in that when I say the crack generation is up until that whole point, the one bloodline that kind of held things together were the women.
Mm.
Okay. And during the crack era had such a devastating effect on women, on everybody, but even more so on women and children.
Mm.
And now we are dealing. That generation is the generation who believes they're in control,
Sure.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that internal trauma during that era blew up. It was always there, right? But that internal trauma just blew up to a whole nother generation because you had a bunch of children who, at least the other generations, there were enough factions to kind of look after the children to a
Right.
certain degree.
Mm-hmm.
But that crack era, man, there was a bunch of young people who had to raise their damn selves, right? And they still trying to hold on to them old 50 and 60 ideals, the children are our future. You still get people quote that crap.
Mm-hmm.
But But when you are raised by trauma, how do you sort out raising your children?
Sure.
How do you sort out uh 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 uh, thriving, right? When we haven't even had that conversation in a real sense,
Right.
right? And so those folks who were children during that time are 40, 45, on the older end, maybe 50, right? In that movement, 12, 14-year olds running projects,
Yeah.
right? You don't know what you doing everything on survival mode
Yeah.
and in the moment. What I call that survival stress management.
Hmm.
And there was a few of them who were smart enough and that kind of stuff to make that work for them in the long run. And then you had the others who were able to escape and might be able to go to college and that kind of stuff, who are trying to come back, the ones who went to college and and said, I'm gonna go and then I'm gonna come back and help my people and I'm gonna work in nonprofits and all this other kind of stuff, and then got a rude awakening from the system itself, right?
Right.
uh uh that people who do this work don't all care that it's getting paid.
Yeah.
Right. And I really don't have a person who does this work and getting paid, long as they're clear about that shit. Right. Because I've seen some folks who do the work and getting paid, but they're honest, and they're direct, and they've done good work with people, you know. And so I think, and the other thing over the last 40 years, and maybe 50, but 40 for sure, is the generations have shrunk.
Hmm.
So we don't really have fully defined generations, because even when you start talking about those different generations, they're all blurred since since
Sure.
the 80s
Hmm.
and 70s. Those generations are blurred because the generations have shrunk.
I agree with that.
Right? Because we still got hip hop dudes who 60 years old still wearing short pants and showing their ass,
They ain't even 60
So
yet. They ain't even there
so
yet.
it's done gotten so blurred, right?
Yeah.
And then my generation, of men, I just heard this morning that cats that I was running the street with, one of them died 4 weeks ago, right?
Hmm.
Another one died yesterday, and this week, who was at I just folks just seen him last week.
Hmm.
We're talking about players, right? And so we're at a crucial time where all of that rolling with the punches, being resilient. We don't have time to grieve. We don't have time to get better. Joy talks about that a lot more now,
Yeah.
in terms of, we have a responsibility to deal with that healing and not letting the system off the hook.
Right.
But again, is we have to we don't have the luxury that other folks might have of, okay, I was an immigrant and I came into the country and I struggled and I got my family together and we can move forward. And there's some struggles there too, because I've been having conversations with different immigrant communities. But we still have to really embrace that full, what that experience, that this experience of America has had on us personally, from a trauma and health standpoint,
Hmm.
and how has it affected how we deal with each other, how we look at the world, and how different folks in our world look at the world very differently than other folks,
Hmm.
and how destructive internally that has had for us to move forward. We don't have the option of rolling with the punches and ignoring it and saying, "Oh well, it is what it is."
Right.
If we are going to come out this with some resemblance of I don't know, safety and care emotionally and physically, right? As a group. I'm
Right.
not talking about individually. I'm talking about
Right.
as a group.
Collectively.
Because, for the most part, I will do okay. My fear is the folks around me, right?
Mm-hmm.
The ones who are not doing okay.
Right.
My fear is for my grandkids and the
Right.
folks around them. They got a good foundation, but you having a good foundation ain't enough sometimes dealing with the world, and especially dealing within our own community.
Right.
Because again, we cannot walk around with this denial that we have not been affected greatly by the trauma we have experienced, and we have a responsibility to both acknowledge that trauma and deal with it internally. And in the long run, I believe if we dealt with it honestly internally, it would affect how people will deal with us externally.
Right.
I've seen it in practice.
Yeah, I agree with that. I
I've seen it in
don't think
practice.
that's our goal, but I agree with it because we'll get focused and make that the overall goal while we're healing, so everybody else treats us better. And I'm like,
yeah, because the thing is I can do more about what's going on with me internally, which is the most difficult. But I know, like I said, by experience, once I got a handle on what was how my trauma was eating me up eternally and causing me a great deal of problems with relational and how I looked at the world. Once I got a handle on that, the world looks very different to me, and the external deals with me slightly different than it deal with other. I hear that all the time. Why do they deal with you differently than they deal with me? Because I'm not having it.
Right.
And then the thing is if it's out of my control, I let it go. It's like, why didn't you fight for that? Man, I examined that whole thing, and it was better for me to let that shit go, right, and go and be here to fight another day. Okay. I ain't got to prove nothing to none of y'all. Right. If I'm not, I don't need to be one of them folks say, oh man, that brother, man, he threw down and he did this and he did that. And y'all speaking over my dead body. I can't do nothing with that. But it's harder to do that when your mind is cluttered with unresolved trauma. The clarity is gone.
Right.
And then, and having clarity after the fact is the worst thing in the world.
Let me ask a question on that. Because I think a lot of times the trauma's been so normalized for folks that it's unresolved and it's like unnoticed. if that's one way to, like, they just don't know that it's trauma. And I'm asking this question based off an experience I had about a month ago. I did a training, and there were some Hennepin County folks there, and there were some probation officers. And it was interesting that they asked me this question because that wasn't really my focus for the talk. But they had asked, they said, Brandon, the person said, I'm a probation officer. And, I deal with a lot of black males. I'm a Hennepin County probation officer. And what she said was a lot of these black males who come to me have PTSD diagnosis, like on their records, but they're not showing anything PTSD related. And she said, based on your clinical assessment, why do you think that is? And she's black. She's a black woman. Right. She said, look, I'm from the community. I'm trying to figure this out. And my answer was, well, you got to think about it. Yes, clinically, they may have met the criteria based on what they went in and said to the psychologist or the therapist or whoever did the diagnostic assessment. They might have met the criteria for PTSD based on what it says in the DSM-5. But in their day-to-day actions, and when you check in on them and see how they're doing, they're not having any PTSD-like symptoms. And I said the reason for that is the trauma has become so normalized that it's not seen as a post-traumatic stress issue For them, they're just living their life and surviving. And it was like a light bulb click. And they were like, we should have just talked about that because everything else you did was great, but that was what I came for, was to just understand. And I think that goes back to your point a second ago, is that we are so deep into this in these generations, as we talked about, especially in today's generation. We're so normalized. I don't even think people realize that it's trauma that's going on. I think they just take it as almost like this is just how my life is supposed to be. And that's a scary place to be, because when you are someone who's trying to help others recover, repair, move forward or whatever, and you're telling them that something is not quite right with what they're doing or how they're living, then it's like you become a target because you are telling me something different than what I already know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that goes back to that piece that I came up with around survival stress management.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's what it is.
That should be the book.
Living in the moment.
Yeah.
Whatever works in the moment. We got a whole generation of young folks. You see, the systems are not off the mark with this. Again, this last one we did, if we would do an examination or a research project on the last 40 years, like I said, we've been catching hell for over 300 years, right? Yeah. Almost 4. Or over 402, right? But that last 40 years has this exploded the response of those other several hundred years. This blew it out the water, right? Yeah. So we have and so again, we're talking about children raising themselves in trauma. They're actually the grandparents now. Wow. And now all of us didn't experience it the same way, but so many of us in parts of our community have, that we're all affected by it, right? So you get this black probation officer ask you this question, right? And she looking at the diagnosis, but the diagnosis is based on who's normal.
Right.
For one, okay.
Right.
And so the thing is that we got, and I keep saying we got a generation of people, and I work with them, who have learned to live off of nothing and smile about it.
That's so mad. That's painful to even hear.
But it's true.
I know that's why it's painful, because it's the truth.
I mean, they have their own economy, their own way of surviving,
communication,
everything,
rules, norms. It's a culture. Right. It's a culture.
And now all of them are probably violating some kind of law, right? And they'll make statements like, the only thing that happened is I got caught. And they have no regard for policy and law, because policy and law has never been fair to us.
Right.
And they have little regard for us old people, because we ain't been honest. We can't even be honest with our own selves. Right? And because I am such at a level of mental depression, I need even more over-the-top stuff to feel good. I need more over-the-top sex to feel good. I need more over-the-top excitement to feel good. I need over-the-top excitement to the point where after I done killed one person or shot up something, and I have little or no regard for me in long term.
Yeah.
My excitement is the adrenaline is when I'm shooting out of a car at somebody else, and we still in the system still talking about gangs.
Yeah.
And truly there is a small amount possibly in each community that's responsible, but again, that small amount has an effect on a larger amount of young people.
Yeah.
So I could be a good kid trying to do the right thing. That ain't gonna keep me from getting the goddamn gun.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to mess around and mess my whole life up shooting at somebody who was shooting at me, or I get geeked up by one of my cousins. We got to throw down for the family. And we still want to have these old ass conversations about gangs and not want to have a conversation about trauma and healing,
Right.
and people feeling disregarded as a human being. And if I feel disregarded as a human being, why would I disregard you? So
Right.
we got 5 minutes.
Yeah, let's get ready to wrap it up. I mean, I don't think people understand one of the things that you said earlier about building a life out of nothing. Because when you're at that place in that space, it doesn't take much for you to throw away nothing because you ain't got nothing.
Right.
There's nothing holding you back. I seen it was really heartbreaking. Honestly, I seen this clip a few days back. A woman just gave birth to her first child, and they brought on the news. It was a bring back because she lost her baby's father to an incident that happened. They were over at McDonald's and they were in two cars. Her baby's father was behind her, and she was in the car with her aunt or some other woman. And there was a car blocking the way. It was a truck. So she's trying to get around them. So she honks and she gets around them. Somebody yells at the car at her. So the guy hears them yelling at his woman, and he says, "Hey man, chill out. That's my girl in there. Like, just chill out. You can hear and see all this on the camera." Somebody from the back of the Jeep of the truck just hops out with a gun, fires about 10 rounds in the car, and you just see homeboy's car just slowly creep up, and he just died just because he said, "Yo man, like, just can you get out? Can we just get through the parking lot?" Folks were just trying to get through the parking lot, and that ended this man's life. And I don't know if this was his first child or not, but he's not going to be there to be the father to his child. And not only this is not a moment of a celebration, it's a moment of grief for this family. And this is on the news. This is locally too. This is right here in Minnesota, over north. And I was just like, man, like it just took that can you chill out? That's my girl in the car. To I'm gone within not even 60 seconds. And again, we have way too many people, even if it is a small percentage, it's too many people within our community that just don't care, and they will take your life over the smallest thing.
Well, it's because they don't know how to, because they don't feel like they don't feel like folks cared for them.
There we go.
So
unfortunately,
on that note, any last words? Because you done got me all riled up, and I ain't got no more time. And we'll continue this conversation.
The only last thing is, the healing definitely needs to start within, and we really need to push this thing forward. We're losing way too many people for way too many reasons, and the trauma's impacting our health, our well-being, and our spiritual selves. And the work, unfortunately, the work needs to, it's massive, but it definitely can be done. So on that note, we're going to wrap up today's episode of the Healing Brothers podcast. Be sure to share this within your social networks. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you like the Healing Brothers podcast, don't be afraid to give us a holler and let us know what you enjoy about the podcast.
Good night.
We'll see you next week.